Good afternoon, and thank you for joining ADA for this webinar on LGBTIQA+ experiences in disasters and recovery. My name is Amanda Leck, and I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm delighted to be your host today. I wish to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters across Australia. Here in Victoria, we are currently celebrating Midsummer Festival, and while Midsummer brings together a diverse mix of LGBTIQA+ artists, performers, communities and audiences, we thought it an appropriate time to explore the disaster and recovery experiences for these communities. Developing understanding and using the language and terminology associated with the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender diverse, intersex, queer, asexual and questioning communities can help ensure that services are inclusive and respectful. Research indicates that pressures faced by same-gender attracted young people, such as bullying, homelessness and feelings of shame, fear and confusion, do not stem from the nature of their sexual or gender diversity. Rather, they are driven by the fear of or actual discrimination by institutions that are important in their lives. Today, we will be hearing about some important research on the impacts and specific needs of LGBTIQA+ communities in disasters. I will introduce our speakers shortly, but before I do, I would like to provide you with some brief housekeeping notes. Today's event will be recorded and made available after the event. Today, we will be using the Q&A feature on Zoom to take questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat window. You will be able to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I will do my best to ask a number of these to our speakers following their presentations. I encourage you to use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentations. And just a reminder that you will need to select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu for everyone attending today to view your messages. I would also like to remind you to be respectful to each other and our presenters when posting your comments or questions. And finally, this webinar may be sensitive for some participants. Our team has put some information about services you can access in the chat box. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker for today. Steve O'Malley, AFSM, Firefighter, Diversity Inclusion, Fire Rescue Victoria. Steve is a leading firefighter and diversity and inclusion officer with Fire Rescue Victoria. He has been an operational firefighter for more than 32 years and is a graduate in the study of human rights. Steve is a board and honorary life member of Women and Firefighting Australasia, a foundation member of the Emergency Management Victoria Gender and Disaster Task Force, and a Fire Rescue Victoria Family Violence Contact Officer. Steve is a long-standing presenter and advocate for prevention of violence against women and gender equity. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Amanda, for a beautiful introduction, not just the part where you speak about me, but the welcome to the country as well. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which I am, which is the same as Ada in the city of Melbourne, so the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Also, I'd like to acknowledge that we are presenting during Midsummer, the second day into Midsummer Festival this year, and which makes this this presentation even more salient. And the timing isn't by accident. We did time it around this, but that good timing, we can thank Ada. Sorry, if I could thank Greg, Amanda, Charlotte and Melissa behind the scenes, because it's great to be here speaking to you all again on this subject matter, something I'm pretty passionate about, which is the Gender and Disaster Pod. So basically what I'll do today is give a bit of a background. If we can move on to the next slide, bit of a background to the GAD Pod in case people haven't seen a presentation before or haven't been to any of the training. And the Gender and Disaster Pod was established in 2015. Basically, the research started in 2009 by Dr. Deb Parkinson and Claire Zara. Claire, unfortunately, is no longer with us. She passed away in 2015, the same year that the pod was established. And what I can, before I go on to the next slide, I'd like to say that we do honour Claire every year at the Emergency Management Conference here in Melbourne. So I'd like to thank those organisers because they see the value in the work that has been presented by Deb and Claire and those who have carried the work onwards since Black Saturday, the research into the compounding effects of gender in disaster. So quick mention there, it does get highlighted in the next slide, but we can just go through here. The initiatives of, I've got to mention Women's Health Goulburn North East and Women's Health in the North because they were instrumental in the research in the first place. Mudri as a research institute, as a place of academia, we're an important third player in this, but the research was unashamedly launched by women's health service providers with a feminist framework and a gendered lens, particularly looking at the effects on women post-natural disaster or post-disaster, as we say now. And by that, we mean the increase in family violence. The research was the starting point, but there's also advocacy and there's training. There's the portal, which is the last slide where you can tap into the roadmaps, you can look at the research, look at videos, look at all sorts of tools and resources. Thanks for that, Greg. And that is an important touchstone for us because all of what we do, all of what we research, all of what we train is contained within that portal. Thanks for that. Back to the second slide, the last point is where we're here today. So the research the GAD Pod expanded its remit to include the emergency experiences and needs of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex people. To those community members that Liam will speak about later, and I won't go into it anymore, except the fact that that increase or that expansion of that research was something that puts a lot of people in the sector, being as male dominated as it is, kind of out of their comfort zone. So I have learned a lot in the time that I've been presenting, not just for the GAD Pod in the increase in family violence, but also with Liam, in particular, the series the module that Liam and I deliver as part of the training packages, because it really, and the feedback is invariably great because it's the sort of stuff that isn't really considered in an emergency management context. So we can go on to the next slide. This illustrates a little bit about what the GAD Pod's been up to since 2009, when the research was first embarked by Deb and Claire. And the green icons there, they're hexagons, aren't they? I think, yeah. So those green ones there are a little bit of a highlight as to the research that expanded research that included looking at LGBTIQ plus communities and the effect of them in disaster context as well. So there's a lot of stuff there that this isn't readily available, but you will be able to see it as a part of the presentation when it goes online. But there's a proud body of work here that I'm really grateful to have an association with and quite proud of. On the right-hand side in the bottom is the mention of the Claire Zara oration. And very proud of that as well, having Liz Broderick, the then Sex Discrimination Commissioner, and Sir Angus Houston as the first orations. And then Caroline Taylor from CFA. We've had Tracy Spicer, Mary Barry in her capacity as CEO of Our Watch, Gerald Richter in her capacity as CEO of Vic Health at that stage. So and this year, Dr. Nikki Vincent, who's the inaugural Gender Equality Commissioner, will be delivering the Claire Zara oration at this year's conference. So if we go on to the next slide, that's a little bit about the history of the GAD Pod. There hasn't been a pause necessarily in the work that the associates have done, associates like me, trainers, and valued members of what was the task force in 2009 and became the GAD Pod task force in 2014 and the GAD Pod in 2015. The first major piece of research that hooked me, because I've been in the violence prevention sector for quite some time, and this, for about 4 years prior to this, but The way he tells it, the relationship after Black Saturday was initially what Deb and Claire set out to investigate, which was the increase in family violence after a disaster. And the reason we use the term disaster, and Liam will touch on this a little bit later, is because we're not talking about natural disasters anymore, particularly when we're doing our training, because all of disasters, say including COVID-19, have a human element to them. So there's a social existence around this. There's climate change. There's deliberate setting of fires in a fire context. So increased flood, what we used to term natural disasters, is more likely to be termed just disasters, full stop now. So the work that Deb and Claire did initially, the Hidden Disasters conference, was what sucked me in 2012, because it was unashamedly about, once again, the increase of family violence, but it also had an emergency management context that really resonated with me, having been a privileged white heterosexual male in the services for as long as I was and am still. If we move on to the next slide, it deals with the second piece of work, the most important second piece of work, because as I said, unashamedly, Deb and Claire went into these communities looking at the effect on women, but it became very apparent very quickly that this was also about the men. The fact that when they asked men how they were feeling and what reactions they felt in regards to how the effects on them post Black Saturday, it was interesting. So the list here sort of goes through that. We know that they're severe and long lasting. I've gone through this slide once before in a presentation, or we go through this slide every presentation pretty much, but this is what the researchers found on the effects of men. Men in particular can be penalised for seeking psychological help. And remember, process this in relation to now, in 2021, 2020, considering the Black Summer fires, and considering most of this, or this research was done in those years post Black Saturday back in 2009. Employment issues, community aggression, increase in male violence against men, against their intimate partners, against people in general. And then notwithstanding that, the health issues, the fact that there's increased self-harm and male suicide, not just emergency services workers, but community members as well. Obviously, increase in alcohol and drug use as well. So that last line there about the gendered norms are more salient, sort of indicates that what was there previously just gets exacerbated and amplified. So we know that domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gendered violence exists. Put a disaster overlay on it and it goes even much more. It exponentially increases. We'll go to the next slide, please. And what that next slide tells us is a little bit about the training packages, which is where I'm moving into now, towards the end of my presentation, my part here. So the lessons in disaster package as a whole is predominantly or ideally delivered in 4 parts face-to-face. We had to, dare I say it, pivot, I said it, this year to do it online. So Liam and I went online, myself and other trainers went online. My organisation supported me to go down to bushfire affected areas to deliver training until COVID hit, and then it got shut down. So we can move on to the next slide, and this deals more specifically with the third part of lessons in disaster training, which is what Liam and I deliver. And this is about, so this is a package in general. Sorry, we'll get to the next slide next. The 4 parts that I spoke about, the lessons in disaster series, are these. So we look at gender and emergency, we look at the evidence, we look at the research, and everything's underpinned by the research, and everything comes back to the research. If we second part, the second session looks at the impacts of gendered expectations. So it looks at the individual, community, and organisation. So we're looking at a socio-ecological model at the impacts on the individual, organisations, community, and the whole of society. Session 3 is what I'm going to talk about just briefly in the next couple of slides, and that's where Liam and I present together. And session 4 is the kicker, where we know that people come to the training, they want to take something away for them. So we talk about how they can enact some concerted change in either as an individual, in their community, or as part of their organisation. Thank you. The disaster made me do it. Series of the presentation that Liam and I put together. Look, it's an exciting presentation. As I say, every time we present it, I get a little bit more out of it. As a heterosexual man, it is a revelation that, and I know this is for other people within the organisation as well, just when you start uncovering and considering difference and the intersectionality throughout communities, how different people can be affected differently. Move on to the next slide, thanks. And basically, this is just a brief outline of the session itself. It's a 3-part session. Liam does the lion's share of this without a shadow of a doubt. I jump in here and there in my emergency management experience and my gendered experience within the emergency management sector. The family violence is spoken about in this section as well, but this is predominantly about sex, gender, and sexuality. And Liam, we'll talk more about that. And had you done the training, or if you've been to a session, you would have, been blown away by the sort of content that Liam particularly presents. And I will refer to the wedding cake model at the first slide there, because that, in my eyes, is quite the revelation as well. We can't go into everything today, but you'll get a feel. And to the next slide, the aims and outcomes are really important, because we want people to take away the experiences that the research tells us, and Liam's lived experience and Liam's experience through being part of research into the effects on gay lesbian communities. And we encourage people to actually consider their own schemas around sexuality, about gender, while they're throughout the course of the module, and as they walk away when they do their planning as part of the 4th part of the training series. So we look at heroic masculinity. We don't necessarily go down the toxic path, but we look at hypermasculinity certainly, and we look at the hero narrative as well. On to the next slide, and I'll just play a brief video for you. I'm looking at the time, and we will get through this, and I'll go through I wanted to draw the attention to you. This is part of the presentation that we do, and you may well have seen this video before. It's force majeure. I just want you to focus on the blue jacket, the pink jacket, and the 2 children in the middle of the screen. The reactions of the man, particularly in the blue jacket. What we want you to consider here is the pressure to conform to gendered roles in a disaster.
Jättegott.
Finns det ingen parmesan?
Oj, kolla här.
Då var det där en lavin eller?
Ja, stenen är kontrollerad. Alltså, det är såna jäkla krafter.
Är det safe?
Ja, de vet vad de gör.
Pappa!
Det är ingen farligt. Harry, det är lugnt. Harry!
I can talk over this a little bit. The volume hopefully isn't affected too much. It might actually get quelled while I talk, which is fine. So basically what you hear now as a result of the whiteout, which was a control blast, you'll hear the sirens go off, and people will slowly return back to the tables in which they were sitting, because they realised that it was a controlled avalanche, basically. So what we ask participants to look at as part of the training is the reactions of people and the expectation of the person who assumed the role of the protector, and how he actually reacted in uncertain scenario, where he was the one reassuring everyone, he was the one holding his son back, he was the one saying everything was going to be okay, and he was also the one that ran the quickest and the furthest away from the scene. So I won't take up too much more time. It does end shortly when the family dusts themselves off and sit back down. So basically what we're looking at here is, as I said, the pressure to a man in this situation, or a control situation, in an emergency situation. So we ask participants to actually consider that a stay or go scenario, the fact that predominantly men, this is a little bit hard to hear, okay, that predominantly men are the ones that make the decision about whether they stay or go. Now, and I'll say a couple more words afterwards.
Så då vet vi vad det är väl. Vad fan, det är vad... Där kommer solen.
Okay, so we can get back to the slideshow. Thanks for that, operator. Greg. So basically, as I said, the reactions, you can look at that. It's called the avalanche scene in a movie called Force Majeure. It was remade in America last year, but I implore you to look at the movie because it's not just that scene, but that scene does set the movie up to look at the gendered expectations of men and women in a pressure scenario like that, where he acts in a way that defies what the societal expectation and the expectation of his family is. What we're trying to do throughout the course of our training are these points here: disentangle masculinity from firefighting. But this isn't just about the emergency responders. This is also about community as a whole. Stop expecting men in community to protect their home and women to protect their children. That's a definite gendered role that doesn't have great outcomes quite often. Let men be vulnerable. I think we moved on a long way from 2009 to now. We want to ensure that women and children's rights to live free from violence is unconditional, even after disaster. Thank you. Next slide. And finally, I'll wind up here just by going through these last couple of slides. And this is on the ADA's Knowledge Hub. And once again, thank you to Amanda and Greg and the others the others in the team at ADA for affording us this time and space again to talk about the work of the GAD Pod. And you'll be able to find this, and it's the CV, an extensive CV about the activities, presentations, research, articles. Everything is contained within the CV, which is contained in the portal here and also on the GAD Pod website. Finally, the checklist we talk about. The guidelines is one of the products. The Gender and Emergency Management Guidelines are one of the products of the GAD Pod and of the task force originally, and certainly of the research. This is an example of a checklist that organisations or individuals can take away. We refer to this quite often in the training because, as I said, we don't want people to walk away and do nothing. We want people to walk away and actually be active in how they cast a gendered lens over their workplace, or as an individual, or as a community member. So that's it from me. I'll finish on the last slide, which is the Gender Justice Conference coming up shortly. And ADA, once again, is a supporter of this conference. And thanks again to Amanda and the rest of the team at ADA for getting behind such important work. I'll leave it here, and thank you very much for listening in.
Thanks very much, Steve. That was an incredibly powerful video. I haven't seen that before, but I think it really unpacks that whole issue that we saw in the research from the 2009 fires about decision-making around leaving or staying and who was effectively making those decisions on behalf of families. I think that 2-minute video really sums up the experiences of many people on Black Saturday and the outcomes that we saw. So thank you for sharing that with us as well. I'd now like to go to Leonard from the Gender and Disaster Pod. Liam has over 20 years experience as an LGBTIQA+ advocate and is the former Director of Rainbow Health Victoria at Trobe University. He has worked on LGBTIQA+ legislative reform, led the development of the world's first LGBTI-inclusive service accreditation program, the Rainbow Tick, and lectured and published widely on sexuality, gender studies, and social policy. More recently, Liam has worked with the GAD Pod researching and developing training on LGBTI people's experiences of disaster and the impacts of COVID-19 on Victoria's family violence crime and prevention workforce and LGBTI people's intimate and familial relationships. And just a reminder before I hand over to Liam, please keep those questions going in the Q&A box. We will have about 15 minutes at the end of the session for us to get through as many questions as we can. Thanks very much, Liam, and over to you.
Thank you. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all variously listening to today's presentation. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also I'd like to thank Steve for his presentation, and to Amanda, Greg, Melissa and Charlotte, and for the invitation from ADA to present. First slide, Greg. Today I'm going to be relying on 3 pieces of research. The first 2 bits of research are on the screen at the moment, and I'll take you through those. They were research that Deb and I led in Victoria, looking at LGBTI, not Q&A plus in this case, people's experiences of emergencies. And the third piece of research I'll talk about very briefly at the end is the literature review I did for Respect Victoria, looking at the impacts of COVID-19 restrictions on LGBTIQ+ Victorians. Now, the first piece of research was a study where we looked at LGBTI people's emergency experiences, and we interviewed 12 people in Victoria. We also conducted a survey of emergency personnel's knowledge of LGBTI people's emergency needs. And as the second part of that, we ran a series of very in-depth interviews with 4 lesbian and bisexual women, asking them about their experiences as clients, staff and volunteers. So they're quite unique 4 women of emergency services in Victoria. Click again, Greg. And this is the cover of the initial report. The next slide. Now, the first research, I want to talk about what is the need for research like this before I actually go into the data. And I want to argue that there are 2 common objections to research on LGBTIQ+ people. And one of these is that in targeting LGBTIQA+ people communities, it constitutes somehow preferential or special treatment, singling out LGBTIQ+ people as somehow worthy of extra or additional resources. So people who run this line say, while things might have been bad for LGBTIQA+ people in the past, things like the passage of marriage equality show that that's all been dealt with and they don't deserve special or preferential treatment. So I call that nothing special. And these are quotes from 2 of the emergency personnel in our Victorian study who make this point. They say that one person said, the sooner you drop it and stop trying to make yourself out as victims or different, the sooner your perceived problems will disappear. For fuck's sake, we don't care if you are queer and stop telling us, get over it. And a second emergency personnel who put it a little less bluntly, our organisation is too busy dealing with real problems to discriminate against LGBTI individuals. Next slide, Greg. The second argument, which is very close to the first, but I don't think it's exactly the same, is the point that Steve referred to. And that's, you know, we treat everybody the same. Why do we need to single out particular groups? And in this argument, I think it is the deeply held assumption that good professional practice actually constitutes treating everybody the same. And according to this argument, acknowledging or responding to differences, whether individual or group differences, actually gets in the way of good professional practice. And again, these are 2 quotes from emergency service personnel in the Victorian statewide survey. We treat everybody the same. There are no specific policies or procedures, nor should there be. When a person is on fire or trapped in a crumpled car, their preferred gender, and I want you to notice the term preferred in this person's quote, or sexuality is as irrelevant as their skin colour or religion. And a second comment from an emergency service worker, jokes and banter involving LGBTI slurs do not constitute homophobic or transphobic comments, as there is no intention to hurt or oppress. Gay jokes should be treated no differently to short jokes, fat jokes, jokes about age. People need to be less precious. Now, next slide, Greg. It's worth remembering that those negative judgments or negative comments by emergency service personnel reflect the broader culture in which we live. Emergency services draw on the same heterosexist and homophobic, transphobic elements as the culture at large. So to give you examples of some of the more recent homophobic and transphobic comments, click Greg, I put in 2 quotes. The first is from research done on the Queensland floods in 2011, when a number of gay men reported that they were actually being blamed for the floods in their local community. And if you think that's extreme and unlikely in 2020 or 21, the next click, and you might do the 2 clicks after that, Greg. This is from Israel Folau in 2019, talking about the floods and the fires. He says, God's word says for a man and a woman to be together, they've legalised same-sex marriage. Look how rapid these bushfires, these droughts, all these things have come in a short period of time. God is speaking to you guys, Australia. You need to repent. Now, I think Folau's comments need no elaboration. According to him, it's a simple tale of how being sex or gender diverse is against God's law, and how recognising the legitimacy of LGBTIQA plus people's lives and relationships has brought God's wrath upon all Australians. It's sort of Sodom and Gomorrah with a contemporary Australian twist. Next slide, Greg. However, and click again, and again, thank you. However, I think Scott Morrison's response to Folau is even more problematic. This is what Morrison had to say publicly. Folau is a free citizen. He can say whatever he likes, but that doesn't mean he can't have regard to the grievous offence this would have caused to people whose homes have been burned down. While those who have lost their homes to fires may be critical of Folau using fires to peddle his particular religious worldview, clearly they were not the subject of his judgment. The grievous offence that the Prime Minister talks of is not directed at those who have lost their homes, but at LGBTIQA plus people. The Prime Minister's inability or unwillingness to acknowledge LGBTIQA plus people, his willful erasure of our communities, their needs, and the offence caused to them by the public expression of Folau's deeply discriminatory and offensive attitudes, really just mark another way in which LGBTIQA plus people's needs are backgrounded and disappear. It's against the ongoing dismissal of the value of sex and gender diverse minorities that the research that the GAD Pod has carried out and the development of diverse, inclusive cultures and professional practice within the emergency services is so important. So next slide, Greg. So I want to take you through the Victorian research we did, the large interview-based survey of LGBTI people and of emergency services personnel. Talking about the first survey, which was the 12 LGBTI people who'd lived through an emergency in Victoria, these were the key issues they identified. And these were all barriers to them accessing good quality service. Past experiences of discrimination or the anticipation of discrimination, the attitudes of staff, volunteers and clients within emergency services, fears of being outed, both within their local communities and by or within the agencies for which they work, the loss of safe spaces and LGBTI community supports during and after disaster, and issues around faith-based service delivery. So I'll take you through very quickly just a snippet of data from each of those 5. Next slide, Greg. So this is an example of what one woman said, or a lesbian said. She said, I would be reluctant to invite local services, she said the CFA, or support agencies after an event because after a lifetime of discrimination, I would feel it made me more vulnerable. You don't want the local heroes knowing there are a couple of lesbians living on a remote farm. And so we had a lot of the 12 LGBTI people say their past experiences, whether it was with emergency services or other institutions, just ratchet up their unwillingness and their anxiety to actually deal with emergency services when they were in the middle of an emergency and also during follow-up and recovery phase. Next slide. The attitudes of staff, volunteers and clients. The first quote is from Gorman Murray. He's part of a research team in New South Wales who are looking at LGBTI people's experience of disaster. And he quotes from a study done after the Katrina in the US. He says, in the post-Katrina aftermath, a woman was arrested for using the wrong bathroom. Similarly, in Japan, a woman was called a cross-dressing deviant fag by a volunteer worker. And these are trans women who are being talked about. The second is from our study, and this from one of the lesbian or bisexual women. And she says, the emergency service will be there to engage the community and ask people, have you made a bushfire plan? And they would say something along the lines of, what about your husband? I've got a partner who happens to be female. Sometimes it's easier to just go my husband, just so that I keep getting a smooth service from them without having to stop and have a whole disclosure of sexuality in the middle of a conversation about bushfire plans. So that's some of the concerns about the attitudes of staff, volunteers and clients. The next slide, Greg. A number of people, particularly in regional and rural areas, were very concerned about being outed. So these are people who live in their communities and are very selective about who they let know, whether they're trans or gender diverse or gay, lesbian or bisexual. So this is from one woman. I never told them about my orientation. That's the SES workers. I would face discrimination, no way to risk in the middle of a fire. Second quote, when you are frightened, you don't want to invite more danger as it accelerates the feeling of vulnerability. Also, they don't recognise you as a couple or a family. One of the big issues that comes out of Australian and international research is the loss of safe spaces for LGBTI people and community supports. So one gay man who ended up living back with his cousins because his house had been burnt down said, I stayed with my cousins who were quite conservative. I had to shut off some part of my identity for a little while. And this is Jane, one of the lesbian and bisexual women we interviewed. My idea of recovery centre is that there's all these families and they're all trying to find a spot to put their head down at the end of the day with their family. And that will be a harder space for queer families to be in. Next slide. And finally, faith-based service delivery. I should say that out of the 12, I think 6 of the LGBTI people we talked with had actually accessed faith-based services. And there were really very varying levels of satisfaction. But this quote is indicative of the negative quotes that came out of those people who had bad experiences. And this is a woman talking, I will not approach a church organisations at all. They do not care about my civil rights, rather discriminate against me. I rather avoid them. The next slide, Greg. When we looked at the industry survey, so that's the client survey, that's LGBTI people, when we looked at emergency staff and volunteers and asked them what they knew about LGBTI people's emergency needs, 90% believed that they had the same needs as everyone else during emergency. Nonetheless, a quarter of respondents believed that LGBTI people had particular issues in the delivery of emergency services. Over a third thought that they had a greater risk of harassment than others after an emergency, and only half the greater risk during an emergency. And all that I'm trying to show there is, depending on whether we're talking about before, during, or after, we get quite different responses. And that's indicative of the emergency staff volunteers. They're quite contrary and contradictory understandings of LGBTI people, which isn't surprising. The next slide. The key issues that emergency service personnel identified that LGBTI people face in accessing their services were barriers to service access, family and relationships, health-seeking behaviour, trust, and the issues of trans and gender diverse people. And I'll take you through those very quickly because I know we're going to be short of time. So barriers, next slide, Greg, sorry. Barriers to accessing services, nearly a third of emergency service personnel did believe that LGBTI people faced more barriers in accessing services during an emergency, and nearly a third that they face more barriers after an emergency, so during recovery. Most of the respondents did agree that LGBTI people, or a third of respondents, that LGBTI people and couples and families might experience more difficulty accessing services. And over a quarter believe that LGBTI people were more likely to look after themselves than seek professional help during and after an emergency. Next slide. Click again. And trust was a major issue. So this is one emergency service personnel. Often people who identify as LGBTI have been mistreated or betrayed by individuals or the community in general. Strategies to build trust need to be identified so that the LGBTI community can feel safe in seeking assistance. Click again, Greg. You shouldn't underestimate the symbolic but also real importance of things like the firefighters and other emergency services marching at Midsummer as well as at Mardi Gras. It really does start to develop some of those relationships of trust with the community. And 16% of respondents agreed that they're really the needs of trans and gender diverse people, particularly those undergoing gender affirmation, weren't dealt with well. Next slide. Can we keep going, Greg? I'll go through, I won't talk to these. Yep, next one. Here. So the consequences of that statewide research showed that LGBTIQA plus people who were clients of emergency services had reduced use of access use of and access to essential services, heightened sense of anxiety and self-censorship, which they experienced in their everyday lives, but ratcheted up under disaster conditions or emergency conditions, that there was a lack of appropriate services. And for emergency personnel who identified as LGBTIQ+ people, these are the three of the major problems they face in joining up to a service. So the next slide, please. What I want to do is give you a really potted summary now of a third piece of research, which is the research that the lit review that I did for Respect Victoria, looking at LGBTIQ+ people's experiences of COVID-19. And I've just pulled out two quotes. One again is from Gorman Murray, the researchers in Sydney, who says the marginalisation of LGBT people is heightened during disaster. And the second is from the United Nations High Commissioner, who makes the same point, but about COVID-19. He suggested that LGBTI people may be particularly vulnerable during the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide, please. These were some of the key issues that came out of the lit review, how COVID-19 restrictions were impacting differently on LGBTIQ+ people and communities. One, a number of countries, Hungary, Poland, and some South American countries, took the emergency conditions as an opportunity to pass really discriminatory policies under the guise of public health programs. So these are policies that discriminated against LGBTIQ+ people, and they use COVID-19 as a Trojan horse, if you like. The second is the trauma and the weight of history. For many LGBTIQ+ people, particularly older people of my age, the whole COVID-19 reporting took us back into a time of trauma around HIV. It was so similar. Language of quarantine, daily infection rates, death rates, discrimination, fear. For many LGBTIQ+ older people and some younger people who've had a very fraught relationship with policing, increased policing on the streets because of people going out during lockdowns really was quite traumatic. A lot of LGBTIQA+ people, because of that history, were very wary of actually using the apps and even getting tested. And for those of us who've been through the last 5 years in Australia of the safe schools, of the equal marriage debate, and now the religious discrimination bill, this just felt like another layering of trauma on top of that 5 years of trauma. There was also some disproportionate impacts of social distancing. In Australia, initially, the definitions of family, partner and dependents were deeply heterosexist, though that did change. For many LGBTIQA+ people, their access to the social networks was where they felt affirmed, whereas in their family homes often, or in work situations, they may not have, and they lost those. And for some gay men, their social networks are very tied to their sexual networks. And so not accessing your partners carried an increased, what's the word I'm looking for, sort of reduction of social networks. The next slide. Safety, we know that a lot of young queer kids were having to return home because of loss of employment benefits or educational supplements, and they were often returning to hostile environments that they'd left, environments they'd got away from because they were homophobic or transphobic. And we know that in some situations, I can think of two examples, in South America, one's Panama, where they introduce what's called sex segregated days. Women go out on the Monday, men go out on the Tuesday, women on the Wednesday. And that minimises the number of people in public spaces, but it had a dramatic effect on trans women who were getting harassed, who were getting picked up by police, and whose identity documents didn't match, their sex on their identity documents didn't match their gender identity. We saw an increase in lateral violence from within the queer community, people going at each other. And we also saw a withdrawal of funding from the LGBTIQA+ sector, which is a real issue because it's a sector that's underfunded and a lot of the staff and timing is volunteers. So there's a real issue about recovery of the sector after we go into the post, whenever that happens, COVID-19. Next slide, Greg. So I want to talk briefly, very briefly, about some of the issues this raises for LGBTIQA+ people during a recovery phase from disaster. And this is a quote from Edge Effect, and they're a humanitarian organisation that look at LGBTIQA+ people, particularly in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific region. And that's what they have to say about LGBTIQA+ people during the recovery phase. Next slide, Greg. So I'm going to give you some structural things that we can do. We clearly need policies that model diverse inclusion within relief and recovery policies. We need those people who develop those policies to have an expert LGBTIQA+ advisory group. We need to ensure that all disaster policies consider the needs and name the needs of LGBTIQA+ people. And as the GAD Pod's doing, we're starting to expand the gender and emergency management guidelines to include LGBTIQA+ people. There needs to be financial support in the recovery phase. And I've listed a number of examples there. One of the things that came out of the Edge Effect work is really government shouldn't be pumping funding into recovery phase, in our opinion, to organisations that do not have diverse and LGBTI inclusive policies. And ongoing monitoring and evaluation. Next slide. At the organisational level, we need policies that include LGBTIQA+ people before, during and after, again, an advisory group. We need specific policies about privacy and relief and early recovery services for LGBTIQA+ people who do not want to be outed in their local communities. And we need client data entry forms that have many more options than currently exist. Training, another press, Greg. We need LGBTIQ+ affirming relief and recovery services, considering residential accommodation for LGBTIQA+ young people who do not want to go home to homophobic and transphobic environments. We need LGBTIQA+ recovery and release centres to consider affirmative facilities, safe spaces, changing rooms and so on. We need to consider support personnel and signage where people can see that they have staff who are LGBTIQA+ inclusive, and I put 4 of the flags on the right. And the final way that we might consider LGBTIQA+ people in recovery, next slide, Greg, is to make sure that recovery services, and including emergency services during recovery, but also relief centres, build up lists of inclusive support services in their local areas, and also access to statewide agencies if they don't have local areas. And that's me, thank you.
Thanks very much, Liam. That was really interesting, and I'm sure there was a lot more to get through than you had time to get through, but let's turn to some of these questions. And I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions, so we'll get through as many as that we can. So first up, what are some practical things emergency service and disaster recovery workers and organisations can do to ensure an LGBTQI+ inclusive environment? Perhaps over to you first, Liam.
Well, I think that last slide, I think the first thing you can do is make sure that LGBTIQA+ people are named. Often you'll have generic diversity inclusion policies where at best we're a dot point, but in naming you need to consider what's particular to this group. I think issues around privacy and confidentiality are incredibly important and different from many other groups. There's issues around provision of medications for trans and gender diverse people. There's a need to recognise non-heteronormative families, same-sex partners. So there's a whole set of things you can put in place. I also think at a structural level, beyond a single organisation, I do think we saw during COVID a number of the economic measures that the government put in place favoured men over women in a sense. I mean, that wasn't the intention, I know, but that's what they did practically. They also actually disproportionately affected LGBTIQA+ people and our supports and community organisations. So I think at that level, we now know that, and that should be built into a recovery phase to actually provide extra resources. So there's some ideas.
No, I appreciate that, Liam. And Ada is going to be redeveloping the evacuation planning handbook as part of our program of work. And I think this is a real opportunity to include some of that thinking into the handbook. Steve, did you want to make any comments on that?
Only that we know that there's if not best practice, the top of promising practice, the stuff that QFES does. And I know that colleagues from Queensland Fire and Emergency Services are on the line, and their Allies of Inclusion program isn't just about LGBTIQA+ people or communities. It's about whole of organisational respect and inclusion. So, I mean, rather than just, categorise and pigeonhole, they've gone broader, and it's actually a model for a really inclusive program. And that was born out of, some major advocacy out there in Queensland.
Thanks very much, Steve. You've basically answered the next question I was going to ask, which are you aware of any examples of really good practice? So we will ask our Queensland colleagues to share those and perhaps if someone from Queensland is online, you could put a link into the chat box with, you know, a link to those resources that Steve has spoken about. I think this one might be for you, Liam, but can you further explain what you see as the relationship between binary gender roles and behaviours within heterosexual relationships more generally, and LGBTQI plus matters more specifically within today's webinar topic? And the person says, I'd often think of those as quite separate things.
Oh my goodness, I mean, that's an amazing question, and it just goes in so many different directions at once. One of the things that we've done, Steve and I and the GAD Pod, in linking issues around gender and women to issues around LGBTIQA plus people, is to say that one of the things that links the two is this, I don't know, valorization of a sort of hypermasculinity. And in a lot of the original work on gender, it talks about the relationship between men and women, and it's gendered. It's men being butch and male, and we say that is also sexualized, and that's often not, that is a heterosexual masculinity. So it's a gendering of sexual relations, and that might sound a bit complicated, but what we mean is that it's not just about gender. Those men are also demonstrating, though it's not stated, their heterosexuality. And it's that combination that I think is a way in to think about the relationships between binary gender roles in heterosexual marriages that are fixed, where men are meant to be very masculine in a gendered way, but also demonstrate their heterosexuality. And the two often get woven up with violence, I think. And it's that heterosexuality that brings in LGBTIQA plus people. So in one, I'll just finish one quote from our research. It was a lesbian who was saying that one of the men in her emergency services got very confused when someone who was out, a gay man, put on the helmet. The guy said, well, if a gay man puts on the helmet, but that helmet's a sign of me being really male, what does that say about my masculinity? Well, it also says something about his heterosexuality. So there are links, and we're starting to tease those out a bit in some of the GAD Pod work around how hypermasculinity affects both women and LGBTIQA plus people. I hope that begins to answer that question.
Steve, did you want to comment on that?
Oh, only that who would have thought that the emergency management sector would be ahead of AFL football? Men in AFL football, obviously. Yeah, we celebrate our lesbian footballers like there's no tomorrow. And it's like the fire services. I mean, when men identify that they're gay, I think we're in a position now that we're a lot more accepting because I know who they are and I gauge how they feel. But invariably, for a long period of time now, lesbian firefighters have been accepted wholesalely, like arms open. And I'm not 100% sure how that sort of can be defined, other than the fact that that kind of is a snapshot of what goes in the greater community. AFL is one that comes to mind all the time.
Thanks, Steve. We often find people join our webinars and access ADA resources because they're looking for, you know, practical guidance and assistance with these issues that they're confronting in their day-to-day work. So there's a couple of questions around, you know, what do you suggest as a first step for people who don't fully understand how best to support the LGBTQI community, but also what are some key needs? And I think you touched on some of those earlier, Liam, when you spoke to privacy and medications and so on in that immediate recovery phase. But, you know, for people online who are looking to take those first steps or really understand key needs, could you just maybe outline half a dozen that you see?
Good. My suggestion really is I can give you a list and add more to the ones I've done. So recognition of non-heterosexual family formations, the recognition of trans and particularly non-binary people. They're not detailed. I would suggest anyone who's beginning that they actually look at some of the online training packages that are being offered. So I used to be director of what is now Rainbow Health, and they have a real raft of introductory training. And we used to go out into services and do some preliminary work. So I think that's good. And there are a number of other agencies now, like Transgender Victoria, that offer the 101 training. And they'll fill out more detail. And I think it's better than giving a list, though I've done that a bit in this presentation, I know. And somebody else I saw in the chat box has asked about the rainbow tick. And that goes beyond people who are just beginning, who are interested and don't know and want to learn. But the Rainbow Tick is a national program, and if an agency gets the Rainbow Tick, all of its processes, protocols and procedures have to be LGBTIQA+ people, which would mean lifting all your staff up to a fairly baseline understanding. So there's some of the more practical ways, I think, as opposed
I appreciate that. Yes, Steve?
I was just going to say, one of the best things I heard was when we walked out after one of Lee's presentations at the Emergency Management Conference years ago, a bunch of Assistant Chief Fire Officers sort of huddled, talking about, I wasn't sure what they were talking about. There was a guest speaker who was going to do a workshop that day. But what they were talking about, they were feeding back to each other about what they'd heard the day previously, which was Liam's presentation. And they were saying it in an absolute glowing way, saying, how the hell didn't we know this? And I'd never considered this before, but thank God I know now. So stick your head in the door and do some training.
Thanks very much, Steve. And I know Janine Taylor, and thank you, Janine. Janine's well known to us at AFAC at ADA, has said she's happy to do a session online as an intro and it's just jumped off my screen, to QFAS Allies of Inclusion. So thank you, Janine. My team will be reaching out to you for a future webinar on that. Look, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So in regard to the issues relating to an increased sense of vulnerability when interacting with emergency services, would you suggest that LGBTIQA+ individuals' communities are disproportionately impacted by disasters? And do you think there's a need for more research in this area?
That's a really interesting question. I know the key researchers in New South Wales, Dale Domini Smith and Murray Gorman, they've both got hyphenated names, are starting to look at this question. There is a suggestion that for minority groups, under disaster conditions, the inequalities they face do actually ratchet up. And that's true of women who are not a minority. They are actually a majority. So I often think comparing women to LGBTIQA+ people has some strengths and weaknesses. But groups that experience some forms of marginality under disaster conditions, most of the literature suggests that for all of those minority groups, there is an increase in the discrimination they face. I think for queer, and I'll use the shorthand QA, Q+ people, the sense of vulnerability, anxiety that you feel in your everyday life, where you are continuously monitoring yourself, does ratchet up. That all the data shows. So there are mental health consequences for that. There are also resistances to seeking assistance, which I've been talking about. If your sense of vulnerability, anxiety, and your reminder of all the past discrimination you've experienced ratchets up, you're even less likely to access sometimes the services you need. So yes, I do think there is research emerging that's starting to show that, and there is a need for more research in that space.
Thanks very much, Liam. And look, I'd like to thank you and Steve very much for making time to present as part of our Recovery Matters webinar series. It's been really informative once again, and I'm sure participants have got a lot from this session. So on behalf of ADA, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We will send you an email once the recording from today's session is live on the Knowledge Hub. We would also like to draw your attention to 2 upcoming opportunities to engage with further learning on the topic of recovery. This June, ADA is very pleased to announce that we will be hosting a recovery masterclass facilitated by the very talented Jolie Willis and Elizabeth McNaughton from Hummingley in New Zealand. They'll be travelling out to Australia, and it will be a face-to-face masterclass. Registrations for this have just opened today, and more information is available on our website, and you can see that now on your screen. We are also pleased to share that ADA will be hosting a National Recovery Forum in Sydney on Friday, the 20th of August, in partnership with the Australian Red Cross and other partners. This will follow on from the Australian Disaster Resilience Conference. Registrations for this event will be open in the coming weeks, and this will be a free event, the National Recovery Forum. So look out for that. When you exit today's Zoom session, you will be asked to complete a short survey. We will use this information to ensure our professional development events program continues to meet your needs. It's been a pleasure to host this webinar this afternoon. Until next time, stay safe and farewell. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.